Hi and welcome to another computing video. So in this one we're going to be running through our setup and configuration of our PFsense home firewall. It's massively overpowered for what we need it for here, but I'd rather be overspec than underspec, if you know what I mean. So what we'll do is I'll walk you through the configuration, how I've got it set up and what the services are that we're going to be or that we've got running on there. So let's get straight into it. So the first thing we do is we want to log on to the firewall. Configured it with the normal admin password, a very strong password. Okay, so this is the interface. As you can see here, we are running the latest release, so we're on 2.4.5, and if we move down, you can ignore all the top stuff, but if we move down to the CPU type, you can see here that we're running an i3 at 2 gigahertz, currently at 500 megahertz, but maximum, so it'll flex up and down according to need and throughput. 4 virtual CPUs, as you can see here, which is 2 cores and 2 hardware threads. And we're using AES-NI encryption, so this is encryption or decryption actually on the CPU itself, so we're not using a hardware chip on the board. So moving down, temperature, as you can see here, this doesn't really change no matter what we do with the box, so that's great. And CPU temperature will go up and down, flexing with according to your processes or packages that you've got installed. Memory, we again are overpowered, so we've got 8 gig of memory in this box. Never really goes above 8%, despite all the different services that we've got running. So without further ado, let's look at the services. So we used to run our DHCP server on our PiHole, which then brings me on to the PFblockerNG. So we're now using that on box rather than using off box PiHole. So it does the same thing. It's basically a DNS sinkhole where you can black hole any dodgy domains or adverts or tracking. So what we use it for is really to block access to any malicious domains. We also run Snort, as you can see here, and that's pretty much it. So Snort, DNS Resolver, and PFblockerNG. So let's have a look at what we've got configured. So we're using a number of lists. We're using IP block lists and DNSBL lists, which are to do with the domain, so IP and domain blocking on there, and it's quite active, as you can see here. This is the count, and that's basically the number of domains and IP addresses, and you can see how many packets that we've blocked here. Moving down to our Snort Alerts, we can clearly see that that's doing its job again, so that's an IPS and IDS system. Then moving on to our firewall. So the nice thing about the firewall is that actually the Snort Alerts IP-wise filter into the firewall logs. So for instance, if we trigger a Snort alert and it automatically blocks that IP address, that'll be blocked in the firewall. So that's all there is to it in terms of the interface. So let's have a look at how we've got things set up. Now the first thing I wanted to point out was throughput. So if we just do a quick speed test. We'll just use the standard Google speed test. We're on a 200 meg service. We should be getting around about 20 meg upload. So 200 down and 20 upload. We always tend to get a bit more, which is fantastic, but we get the full speed, which is excellent. As you can see there, 20 meg upload, 220 meg download. So that's the speed test taken care of. So the first thing that we want to do is to show you the general setup. And we'll walk you through what we've got here. So at the moment we're using Google DNS servers for our upstream DNS. There's nothing much else really that you need to be aware of on this one. If we then go to the advanced settings, Again, this first admin access page, we leave it as default, it's sufficient for us. If we move on to the firewall and NAT section, we're using the firewall optimization options as normal. No need to change anything from the default really. I'm not going to talk you through anything here, I'm just running through how we've got it set up for us. Networking, this one's really important. So we've disabled IPv6. Depends if your ISP supports it, then great, go ahead and enable it. But what we have done is we're saying that if you tick this box here, it will allow IPv6, whether you're capable of doing it or not. But we've unticked this, so we block all IPv6 and we just use IPv4. So moving down to this network interfaces piece, this is really important. So our device has actually got Intel NICs, and we found that what we've had to do is disable hardware checksum offloading. We've had to leave hardware checksum offloading enabled, and we've also removed the disable hardware TCP segmentation offload. And we've also removed the disable hardware large receive offload. So these are quite important. So with these two, what we did actually here, we had hardware checksum offloading and TCP segmentation offloading. These were set to disabled. So when we did a speed test, we still got 220 meg download, but we found that our upload speeds was limited to 3.4 megabits a second. So going through here and unticking all of these options here for our Intel NICs resolve that problem. What you have got to do is, obviously, once you save it, you then need to reset your interfaces. So you reload your networking, or the easiest option is to come into your diagnostics tab and then just reboot your device using the option here. Moving on to miscellaneous, we haven't touched any of this. This is all standard default. We have. So we set our cryptographic hardware to use AES-NI CPU based acceleration. So this is using the CPU to encrypt and decrypt. System tunables, this we have not touched at all. And notifications, we've actually set this up so that we get notified when the things don't work correctly. So for instance, downloading some of the lists, if there's an issue there, we'll get notified, and some of the other options. I'm not going to talk about the WAN or the LAN. I am going to talk about the firewall though. So the firewall, I'm not going to talk about itself, but particularly I'm going to talk about PFblockerNG. So as you can see here, we've got this set to enabled. Now I'm just going to whiz back to our dashboard. If you've got a problem with DNSBL from starting up, you need to persist with it. It just means that what actually it's using a mini SQL database, and sometimes it doesn't start correctly. So restarting that service will kick that into action. But I'm just going to go back and talk you through the setup and configuration here that we've got. So first of all, I've enabled it, and then I've told it to keep the settings. So if I ever remove it, it's going to keep the settings so I can reinstall it later easily. That's all there is to it on that home page. Next, we're going to come to our IP page. So this is where you can set it up for GeoIP and some various IPv4 or IPv6 lists and your IP reputation. So what we've got here, we're basically saying dedupe the list, so remove the duplicate IPs. Placeholder IP address is important, so we've not actually changed this. This is just using the standard that PFsense wants. If you're going to be using GeoIP, which we have got it set, but we're not using it currently because we don't run any of those services inbound. It's taken care of with our Snort, for instance, and our standard firewall. But if you wanted to block via GeoIP, you need to go off and create yourself a free MaxMind account. I am going to blur this out, by the way, so you won't see that. Then if we go down to our interfaces, this is important. You want to tell your system that your inbound firewall rules will be running on your WAN interface and your outbound firewall rules are going to be running on your LAN interfaces. And we have come in here to set our firewall auto rule suffix. Normally it says auto rule. We've have ours set to null no suffix, and we've also enabled kill states. So basically, when any blocked IPs that are found in the firewall states, they're going to get cleared when it does an update, when you do a force update. IPv6, we're not worried about this because we're not using it. But GeoIP, this is where you can set your top spammers and things like that. So if you're running your own mail service, for instance, or web server, that kind of thing, this is the place that you would then come in and set all of your various links up. And if you go into the pencil icon here, this will show you actually what is in the list and what you can do to block it. So if you can come in here, hold your control key down, and you can select various countries, or if you want to select everything, then obviously you can do that as well just by using your Control A to select them all. And again, you've got all of your items here that you can go and do this for all of your different lists. So you've got IPv4 on the left and then IPv6 countries on the right. Once you're happy with that, then obviously you want to set it to log and then save your rules. Next we come on to our DNSBL lists, and this is important. So you want to make sure that you've got it enabled. If you're going to be using TLD, so top level domains, if you're going to be selecting this option here, it's going to block all of your subdomains as well. But be careful, if you're on a low powered system, you will take a hit in terms of memory and CPU, but particularly memory. So you don't want to be using that if you've only got a gig of RAM in your device. Virtual IP address, so you want to make sure that you are setting your virtual IP address to an IP address that isn't in use by your system or any other services on your system. In our instance, we've actually just accepted PFsense's default. And then where you want your DNSBL web server to be listening. So the way it works, it downloads the list to your web server and then you pull in your lists from your web server, which is running locally. You want to make sure that you've selected the appropriate LAN interface that is going to be running on. Okay, so permit firewall rules. We like to set our configuration up that uses floating firewall rules. Basically what this means is it puts all of your firewall rules in the same place rather than having separate firewalls for each of your interfaces in the firewall setup. So we've also got this one enabled here, so this will always allow your access to your DNSBL web server, so you want to make sure that that is set there. In terms of whitelist, this is where the standard whitelist list lives. We've not changed this, but whenever you whitelist something, it will appear in here. And the top 1 million whitelist domains, you can specify that here, but in our instance, we're not using that at all. The rest of it is default. We don't change that either. So once you've got that set up, you can then move on to your groups. So as you can see here, we are blocking the DNSBL, malicious and the BBScan 177 feeds. If you want to go in and check what they are, just click on this list here, this icon here, and this will show you all the lists that we've got that are dragged into that group. So abuse, antisocial, and malware basically. We don't block any ads, although we could do, and we don't block any tracking either. But if those IP addresses or domains happen to fall in one of these lists, then they'll be blocked unless you whitelist them, or suppress them from the list, I should say. So that's that. We can go back to the groups again, and this is the group in the feed that we got here. We're only using one list, and I'll show you how you can populate those lists. So if we go to our categories, this is where you would select your Shala list if you've got it. We don't. We've got ours set to disable. And then your safe search, again, we're not using safe search. So if we go back to our groups now and we wanted to add a group, then if you've selected the various lists, they will automatically appear in your groups. So the next section we're going to talk about briefly is update. Cron does its own thing, so we just let that one take care of itself. Reporting, we'll come back to that, so this is where your reports will live. Now, how do we get our lists? Well, we do that via our feeds. So in here, basically this primary one feed is selected by default, which means that you can select a single category here and the various lists will automatically populate into that category. This is priority 2, so priority 1, priority 2, priority 3 and so on, all the way down through your IPv4 and IPv6 lists. As you can see here, there's a whole ton of them. And then we move on to the DNSBL category. So these are more around the privacy lists. We don't use any of these. All we are interested in doing is blocking malicious domains. So as you can see here, we're automatically blocking all of the malicious domains. We are not blocking phishing, although that you probably want to think about doing that. So this is when someone receives an email with a link in it and they click on it. If you're blocking these phishing lists, chances are you're going to be blocking that as well. You want to be careful though, because you may well get some false positives. We're not using any of these HP hosts here from Malwarebytes, but we are using this BBCam 177 list here. The rest of it is all disabled, so malicious too. We're not using any of that because there's likely to be quite a few false positives in there. And we're not using cryptojackers either. So that populates the DNSBL lists and groups based on the categories that you select. So once you've selected all of your different categories, they will appear in your groups here. So as you can see here, here's our two groups. And if we go to our IP lists, they will appear in here. So what we're saying here is priority 1 IP lists. We're denying both inbound and outbound. We're going to block those if we get a match on that. GeoIP, as I said, we're not using, and we're not using IP reputation either. DNSBL lists we are using and we are blocking. So what happens when we get a block? Well, if we go back to our dashboard, we can see here the number of packets that we're blocking for IP lists and also our domain lists. So you can click on these packets and that will take you to the reporting for each of those. Or when you are in your PF blocker, you can go into reports and that will give you the same report. So let's have a look at this and you can see here what we're currently blocking. So the IP blocks seem to be mostly from Russia, but quite a few other countries as well that we're blocking in those lists. If you want to query the IP address, you would click on this information or threat intelligence lookup, and then you can select on from a whole number of different websites to actually go in and find out about what that IP is doing. So let's have a look at FortiGuard IP lookup. Okay, so the category is not rated and it's not analyzed, and click here. Okay, so that one's not rated basically. You will find that on quite a few of them if the source is set to unknown, but eventually they will work their way into those varying lists. It's obviously known about it in the feed here, but in terms of the rest of the information on the various websites, it doesn't know about that yet. But we made a decision and we're blocking it. And then if we scroll down here, you can see here, what are we actually blocking? Well, actually it's picked it up in this malicious domains list. I'm not so sure it is a malicious domain, basically, because it's standard Google Analytics stuff. So you know, I would class that as a false false instance, and you can whitelist it if you really want to. By basically, you can come here and you can click on the plus sign, and that will then whitelist it across your system. So that's the alerts. If we can now move to the IP block stats, this gives you a bit more granularity, and it gives you some pretty graphs as well to tell you you know, where your locations are, and so on and so forth, all the way down to what source port it's using, what destination port it's using. So in other words, depending on whether the source is remote, will determine on what the destination or the source port is. So have a look at those. I'm not going to talk too much about them. And then we're going to move on to our DNSBL stats, which quite clearly you can see it's not malicious at all, because it's standard YouTube stuff. So a lot of these I would class as false positives, although it doesn't interfere with any of the system or what the rest of the household is viewing on YouTube and some of those other websites that are used for social media. If you want to get to the raw logs, you can come to your raw logs file here, and you can select the various logs. So if we go here for the IP blocking, this will pick up the raw data that is being used in our log files, and the same for everything else in here. So that's all there is to PFblockerNG. Now we're going to move on to Snort. We're going to have a quick look at Snort and run through how this has been set up. So we're only running it on our WAN interface because we're basically blocking inbound traffic. And to set up your Snort lists, you would come into your interface and drill in here. So as you can see here, we are saying to our system that we're using a WAN interface because it's the WAN, and we are looking at where we log our traffic, our alerts, and the search methods that we're using BNFA, which seems to be fine for us. There are a whole load of other ones, but we've accepted the default. We then need to tell it what our home network is. So again, just use the default basically, because it will pick up in your list all of the interfaces and say anything matched in this list is the home network, anything not matched in this list is an external network. And then the pass network is where you're configuring your rules to allow pass-through. Suppression of filtering list. So this is when you click on the little plus sign to suppress the alert and allow it. That will then add it to this list here. So moving on to our WAN categories. So what are we actually doing? So what we are using is, this is really important because otherwise you've got to go through all of your Snort rules, files, tick whichever ones you want. So we found it easier to actually tick this box here that says use an IPS policy selection, and then you've got various different policy selections that you can choose. So you've got connectivity, which protects you against the very basics, balanced, which gives you a little bit more security, which blocks balanced connectivity and its own, and then so on all the way through to max detect, which you basically want to test against a new production system. So depending on what lists you are using, we can also tick the emerging threats. So we are using basically malware, botnets, exploit rules, and Trojan rules for emerging threats. So these are ones that have just started appearing in the wild. And the way you set that up, we'll go through that later. Let's move on to WAN rules now. So these are all the rules that we've got in place for our Snort system. The WAN variables, we leave this blank so you can rename stuff if you want. And the WAN preprocessors. So again, we're doing nothing with this. We've accepted all of the defaults, and you might want to tune maybe your SSH detection. Maybe you want to have a look at disabling your HTTP inspect, although I'd really think about it before you do that. The rest of this is basically we've accepted all the defaults. Barnyard 2, so we're not using Barnyard 2, so the way that this works is it creates its own MySQL database where it can dump all of the traffic into, but we've got plenty of memory and we've got plenty of CPU usage, so we don't use that. Next is the WAN IP reputation lists. We don't use that either. You can load up various lists from various resources on that. So that's all there is to it. So that's the basic rules and categories configured for Snort. Then we're going to move on to our global settings. So these are the rules basically. So what we've got here, we're saying we're going to enable our Snort subscriber rule set. Do you want to enable your GPL rule set? Well, we're not using the community rule set, but we are using the emerging threat rules. So just tick the box and sign up for a pro account if you want to use that, but we're just using the open rule set on that. And we are using the open app ID rule set, so source fire detectors. And that's it basically. Down here is important. How long do you want to block your hosts for? So we block our hosts for 1 hour, but if you wanted to just alert and not block, then you would set this to never. So don't block basically. Okay, moving on to updates. This is where you can manually refresh your rules, but they will get refreshed based on your configuration settings that you set at the beginning. We'll come back to alerts, we'll come back to blocked and suppress. Actually, no, we're going to go into alerts. So this is your alerts here that you're getting from the system. Again, you can, let's have a look at these compromised hosts. So if we click on the magnifying glass, that is going to do a DNS lookup for us and tell us what the domain is. So as you can see here, roberto.li, and that's obviously a compromised host that is trying to do port 22, so probably a brute force attack on SSH 22. We're not going to whitelist that, but if we wanted to suppress that alert and allow it, then you would click on the plus sign either by the source or by the destination, or if you wanted to disable the SID itself, so the identifier itself, that would block it across but all sources and all destinations. Moving on, so once an alert is triggered, it will block it in your firewall, so we can have a look at what hosts are blocked. So currently we are blocking 2 hosts, and because of our settings previously and our global settings here, if you remember down the bottom we set that to how long do you want to block that host for. Well, we set it up for an hour, so after an hour this host will be released again. So if the attack continues, it'll continue to be attacked, it'll continue to be blocked, but after an hour that will be released again. And what that takes care of is, you know, say someone's got an infected web server and they go ahead, they clean it and they fix it, then obviously you don't want to be permanently blocking the IP addresses, because actually you might want to get to it in the future. Past lists, we don't use that at the moment. So, you know, what are the rules that you created and the IP addresses that you created for allowing traffic through Snort. We tend to use just the suppressed list. So as you can see here, here's our suppressed list for what we've effectively whitelisted. And the same for IP lists. So the IP list is that list that we ticked the boxes to, one of them was the emerging compromised IP addresses. So if we have a look at the list itself, that will show you what the IP addresses are that are contained within that list. And that will update and refresh itself accordingly based on what's going on out in the wild. SID management, we don't use that, so I'm not going to talk about it. That's all there is to our Snort setup. So let's go back to our dashboard and we'll just have a quick recap what we've got on the dashboard. So PFblockerNG stats are here. Snort interface alerts are set here. Firewall logs are set here, and our services are set here. What I'm going to do is I'll create new videos based on a more in-depth look at each of those, and then we'll get that added to our YouTube channel for you guys to review. So that's all there is to it at the moment. If you found that useful, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future updates. But we will start looking at these more in depth and explaining what each of those does. We just wanted to give you a quick walkthrough on how we've set up our system. So once again, thanks for watching, and catch you in the next one.